Hi everybody, and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast. Hope everybody is well. I'm Rob, your host as always, and this is Season 4, Episode 16. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. We're not just examining a single dark event, we're examining a dark pattern, a rhythm of history that, when you listen closely, sounds eerily familiar. We're asking the uncomfortable question: are we, in the early 21st century, living in a world that bears a haunting resemblance to the one that sleptwalked into the catastrophe of the First World War? It's a question that forces us to hold a mirror to our own times. When we study the years before 1914, we see a civilization brimming with confidence, convinced that its progress, its economic ties, and its modern sensibilities had made major wars obsolete. Yet beneath that polished surface, the tectonic plates of nationalism, imperialism, and militarism were shifting, moving inexorably towards a cataclysm that no one seemed to be able to stop, even as they rushed towards it. Today we read headlines about great power rivalry, unprecedented military build-up, strained alliances, and regional flashpoints that feel increasingly volatile. The echoes are disquieting, and they are hard to ignore. But let me be clear, this is not an exercise in fear-mongering. My goal is not to send you away believing that the Third World War is inevitable. Rather, it is to immerse ourselves in the history of that pivotal pre-war period, to understand the mechanisms and the mindset that led to the collapse. Then, and only then, can we hold that history up against our own time with clear eyes. History doesn't repeat itself, but as Mark Twain is often credited with saying, it often rhymes, it whispers, and it's our job to listen to what it's trying to tell us. So, thinking of this episode as a conversation across a century, a dialogue between the past and the present, because 100 years ago, people told themselves a very comforting story about the impossibility of war. They were tragically, catastrophically wrong. The central question for us is, are we telling ourselves the same story today? With all that being said, lace up your boots as we head back to 1914, where we will warm ourselves by the fires in the trenches, and listen to more dark history. To start, let's first paint a detailed picture of the world of 1914. To do that, we have to understand the profound, intoxicating confidence of the age. Europe was at its zenith in its global power. Its empire spanned the globe. Its technology was revolutionary, and its culture was vibrant. This was the era of Belle Epoque and the Edwardian summer, period remembered for their optimism and brilliance. The tangible signs of progress were everywhere. Electric trams replaced horse-drawn carriages in major cities. The cinema and the phonograph created entirely new forms of entertainment. The first skyscrapers were piercing the skies of America, a symbol of this new modern age. For the growing middle and upper classes, life had a pace and a comfort that was entirely unprecedented. But more than anything, it was the economic and technological interconnection that fostered the belief in a permanent peace. The world was woven together by a web of telegraph cables at the bottom of the ocean, meaning messages could be sent from London to New York in minutes, not weeks. Global trade and finance exploded. Capital flowed across borders with incredible speed. This gave rise to powerful and seductive theories, most famously articulated by author Norman Agnell in his 1910 book The Great Illusion, which argued that war had become economically futile. The cost would be so catastrophic that no rational nation would ever choose it. The bonds of commerce were too strong to break. This wasn't a fringe idea, it was a mainstream thought. In 1911, a British newspaper ran the headline, "Commerce has bound the nations too closely for war." It was an article of faith. But of course, that glittering surface of 1914 concealed deep, dangerous cracks. The geopolitical landscape was a volatile cocktail of rising and declining powers, a classic recipe for conflict, known to political scientists as Thucydides's trap, where the fear of rising powers instilled in an established power makes war likely. At the heart of this was a young, restless and phenomenally powerful Germany, unified only in 1871. Its industrial output had, by the early 1900s, surpassed that of Great Britain. It was a scientific and an economic juggernaut, but it was also a frustrated giant. It had arrived late to the imperial scramble for colonies and found the world already carved up. Its leadership, particularly the insecure and impulsive Kaiser Wilhelm II, felt it was denied its rightful place and respect. This led to the policy of Weltpolitik, or world politics, and its most tangible, dangerous expression, the decision to build a high-sea fleet capable of challenging the Royal Navy. For Britain, an island nation whose security and empire depended entirely on naval supremacy, this was not a provocation, it was an existential threat. The response was a naval arms race of incredible cost and intensity. The launch of the HMS Dreadnought in 1906 made every other battleship obsolete overnight, resetting the race to zero. It became a matter of national pride, fear, and grim one-upmanship. Dreadnought against dreadnought, pride against pride. Meanwhile, France, still deeply scarred by its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, and the loss of its territories of Alsace and Lorraine, burned with desire for revenge. Its entire military doctrine was shaped by the goals of an offensive against Germany. To the east, Russia was a colossus on clay feet, vast, populous, but politically brittle. The Tsar autocratically ruled an empire simmering with revolutionary fervour, yet he had pledged to defend the Slavic interests in the Balkans, a commitment that pulled the giant into a regional dispute. And then there was Austria-Hungary, the fragile multi-ethnic empire, a patchwork of over a dozen different nationalities. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Serbs, Croats and many more, all held together by an aging emperor, Franz Joseph, and the force of bureaucracy. It was an empire terrified of the nationalist aspirations of its own people, viewing any sparks of Slavic nationalism, particularly from the small kingdom of Serbia, as a direct threat to its existence. This brings us to the tinderbox, the Balkans, a region dismissed by many in greater power capitals as a backwater periphery, but one seething with nationalism, revolution, and the fading influence of the Ottoman Empire. In 1912 and 1913, two Balkans wars had already been fought, redrawing the map of the region and showcasing the violent potential of these nationalist ambitions. It was rightly called the powder keg of Europe, and over all of this hung a system of interlocking alliances that created a rigid tripwire-laden continent. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary and Italy faced off against the Triple Entente, which was France, Russia and Great Britain. These alliances were meant to keep peace through deterrence, but they had a fatal flaw. They created a scenario where a local conflict in a place like the Balkans could not stay local. It had to, by treaty and obligation, pull in everyone. The system designed to prevent war instead made it inevitable on a continental scale. Now, let us hold this complex historical mirror against our modern times. The echoes are, frankly, uncanny. The parallels in this narrative are staggering. We too live in an age of breathtaking technological change. The internet, smartphones, artificial intelligence, that connect us in ways those Edwardian telegraph users could scarcely dream of. We too have experienced an era of hyperglobalization. Our supply chains are mind-bogglingly complex and interdependent. A smartphone might be designed in California, with parts from South Korea and Taiwan, assembled in China and sold in Europe. Our financial markets are 24-hour global entities, and we tell ourselves the exact same story. For decades, the concept of economic interdependence has been a cornerstone of international relations theories. The idea that trading partners don't go to war with each other, that echo those from 1910. Global economy, too interconnected for major conflicts, experts say. The confidence is almost identical. The belief that our modern, sophisticated systems have made large-scale war obsolete is a powerful and comforting narrative. But history whispers, they've said that before. Once again, we are living in a multipolar world, where an established power is facing a rapid and determined rising power. The United States, the preeminent global power since 1945, is now facing a sustained challenge from China, whose economic and military rise in the last 30 years is without modern precedent. This is the quintessential Thucydidean dynamic. China, like Wilhelmine Germany, feels it deserves greater respect and influence, corresponding with its economic weight and historical stature. Its actions in the South China Sea, its Belt and Road Initiative, and its rapid naval modernization are viewed by Washington and its allies with the same nervousness that the British viewed the German High Sea Fleet. We see the same hardening of alliances into blocs. NATO, revitalised and expanding after the post-Cold War lull, is the modern equivalent of the Entente. And on the other side we see China, forging deepening strategic partnerships with Russia, despite their historical differences, and through institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, creating a counterbalance to Western influence. These alliances, again, are meant for deterrence, but they also create the same risk of entanglement, where a conflict between an ally and an adversary could rapidly draw in major powers. We also see the same arms race, though the weapons have changed. In 1914 it was the dreadnought, today it's a race for hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare capabilities, artificial intelligence integrated into military systems, and the modernisation of nuclear arsenals. The Pentagon releases reports on China's military power, and Beijing does the same regarding US encirclement. Each side insists its build-up is purely defensive, just as they did over a century ago, and each side feels increasingly threatened by the other's actions. And then we have our own modern tinderboxes, our own powder kegs. Then it was Sarajevo, and today the list is worryingly long. Ukraine, a conflict on the border of Europe where a major power, i.e. Russia, has sought to redraw the borders by force, directly challenging the post-Cold War order and drawing in the Western support for the defender. Taiwan and the South China Sea, perhaps the most direct parallel, where a rising power, China, claims territorial sovereignty over a key region and a democratic island, and it has not ruled out the use of force to achieve these goals, while the established power, the US, is treaty-bound and committed to maintaining the status quo. We also have the Middle East, a perpetually volatile region where great power proxies, the US, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, engage in complex conflicts from Syria to Yemen with the constant risk of a miscalculation that could escalate. The pattern is clear. A world that believes itself too modern for war, yet is simultaneously constructing the very architecture of conflict through rivalries, arms build-ups, and rigid alliances. In 1914, the mechanism for disaster was already in place. It just needed a spark. That spark came on June 28th in Sarajevo, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist. It's critical to understand that this was initially a local event, a brutal political murder, but one in a volatile region known for political violence. The Austro-Hungarian government, seeing a final chance to crush Serbian nationalism that threatened its empire, decided to use the assassination as a pretext for a local war. But here's where the machinery of alliance and military timetables took over. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, so severe that it was designed to be rejected. When Serbia surprisingly accepted most but not all points, Austria-Hungary declared war anyway. This triggered Russia's alliance with Serbia. The Tsar could not abandon its Slavic ally and ordered a mobilization of its vast army. Mobilization in the military dogma of the time was not seen as a precaution, it was seen as an act of war. Germany, bound by its alliance with Austria-Hungary, saw Russia's mobilization as the casus belli. It preemptively declared war on Russia, and crucially activated the Schlieffen Plan, a long-prepared strategy to avoid a two-front war by knocking France out first with a lightning-fast invasion through neutral Belgium. The invasion of Belgium is what brought Britain into the war, bound by a treaty to guarantee Belgium neutrality. Within weeks, a single assassination in a peripheral European city had dragged every major power on the continent into a war that none of them truly wanted. But all of them had, through their policies, alliances, and military plans, made inevitable. They were sleepwalkers, trapped on a path they had built themselves. The shock from the ordinary people was absolute. The Parisian newspaper that wrote, "Yesterday we spoke of progress, today we march to the front," perfectly captured the whiplash of a world that believed in peace one moment and was at war the next. Today, we have to ask, what is our modern equivalent of the July crisis? What is the mechanism that could turn a regional flashpoint into a global conflagration? It's not hard to imagine. A clash over a disputed island in the South China Sea between Chinese and Philippine vessels leads to a sinking in depths. Treaty obligations pull in the US. China, perceiving this as American aggression on its doorstep, takes retaliatory action. The complex web of alliances in the Pacific, US with Japan, South Korea and Australia, activates. Cyber attacks cripple infrastructure. The flow of trade through the world's most critical shipping lanes halts. The crisis escalates, hour by hour, in a world where decisions have to be made in minutes, not days. Or a catastrophic miscalculation over Ukraine. Or a strike on Israeli soil that draws in the United States, and in response Iran and its allies, creating a global energy crisis and direct confrontation. The potential sparks are there. The alliance structures that could globalize them are in place. The historical echoes of local crisis spiraling out of control due to rigid alliances and military posturing is perhaps the most unsettling parallel of all. But here is where we must pause and take a breath. Because of all the powerful and disturbing parallels, history does not repeat itself exactly. The world of 2025 is not the world of 1914, and the differences are just as important as the similarities. There are reason for hope, and are imperatives for caution. First, and most importantly, is the existence of nuclear weapons. In 1914, generals on all sides promised a quick and decisive victory. They believed the war would be over by Christmas. They were catastrophically wrong. Today, no leader of a nuclear-armed state labours under that illusion. The concept of mutually assured destruction is a terrifying but fundamentally stabilising reality. A major war between great powers is no longer a matter of a national victory or defeat. It's a potential end of civilization itself. This reality imposes a level of caution and a desire for off-ramps that simply did not exist in 1914. Even the most reckless actor is ultimately constrained by the shadows of the bomb. Second, we have the international institutes. In 1914 there was no United Nations, no WTO, no IMF, no G20. There was no neutral forum for constant dialogue. Today, while these institutes are often criticised for being slow, bureaucratic and toothless, they exist. They provide a permanent table for negotiation. They allow for sanctions and international condemnation that, while imperfect, are forms of pressure and conflict that fall short of hot war. The European Union itself, a project born from the ashes of 2 world wars, has made war between members like France and Germany virtually unthinkable. It has also instilled virtually unbreakable alliances between France, the UK, Spain and Portugal, etc., which for time immemorial was unthinkable. These institutes act as a shock absorber in a crisis, something wholly absent in 1914. Third, the speed and nature of communications are utterly different. In 1914, leaders communicated by encoded telegrams. Ambassadors and monarchs wrote letters that took days to arrive. Misunderstandings could fester and narratives could harden without direct contact. Today, the hotline between Washington and Moscow, and presumably Beijing, is a literal thing. Leaders can pick up a phone or jump on a secure video call within minutes. While miscalculations are still possible, the ability for rapid, direct communication to de-escalate a crisis is a significant buffer against the kind of unchecked spirals that characterised the July crisis. Finally, the very nature of conflict has changed. In the 21st century, great powers compete in a grey zone. They fight through economic sanctions, cyber attacks that cripple an adversary's infrastructure without dropping a single bomb, disinformation campaigns that seek to destabilise societies, and proxy wars where they support local fighters rather than committing their own troops. This doesn't make a world safer or more just, but it does create a longer, more complex ladder of escalation. The path of outright, total, conventional war between major powers is much longer and more fraught with off-ramps than it was in 1914, when the only option seemed to be mobilisation and capitulation. These differences are profound. They are our firebreak. They are the reason why we are not doomed to repeat 1914. They should calm our immediate fears of an inevitable slide into world war. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this differently dark episode. I hope I haven't scared you too much. So where does this leave us? The story of 1914 is not a prophecy. It's a warning, a cautionary tale about the fragility of peace. It reminds us that prosperity is not a shield, that economic interdependence can be overthrown by nationalism and fear, that alliances can trap nations as much as they can protect them, and that leaders can make a series of small, rational decisions based on military timetables and perceived slights that together lead to a collective, catastrophic outcome. But it's a reminder that nothing is inevitable. The difference between 1914 and today is that we have their example. We can hear the whispers of their history. We know how the story ended for them. The real danger is not that history repeats itself, but that we become complacent and ignore their lessons. The parallels we see today are not a sign that war is coming. They are a sign that the conditions that can lead to war are present. They're a call to attention, a call to strengthen our institutes, to pursue diplomacy with relentless determination, to create robust crisis communication channels, and to be actually aware of the dangers of rigid alliance structures and security dilemmas. The question at the beginning, are we making the same mistake, has a complicated answer. We are making some of the same mistakes, engaging in arms races, hardening alliances, and believing a little too much in the myth of our own invulnerability to large-scale conflict. But we also have the tools they lacked: a sobering deterrent of nuclear weapons, international forums for dialogue, and the gift of their historical example. History's whisper is not a prophecy of doom, it's a call to vigilance, to wisdom, to active, engaged statecraft. The sleepwalkers of 1914 didn't see the abyss until they were falling into it. We have no such excuse. We are wide awake with the map of the past in our hands. The future of peace depends on reading it correctly. You know, we often talk about history repeating itself. We look at the tensions in the world today, the political divides, the economic anxiety, the nationalist movement. We get a chilling sense of déjà vu. It's easy to see patterns and assume we're on the same tragic treadmill, destined to make the same mistakes. But I want to suggest something a little different. I think history is less like a loop that repeats and more like a spiral. The themes are familiar, the rhymes across the centuries, but the context is always new. The players are different. The world has changed. Let me give you an example. I personally believe the Second World War and the rise of Hitler and his plans for Germany were not some random historical event. They were a direct product of the First World War and the vindictive, crushing conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. But then you have to ask, what was World War I a product of? Well, if you look at it through the lens of France and Germany, it was a product of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. In that conflict, Prussia demolished France, and in the subsequent Treaty of Frankfurt imposed its own harsh, vindictive conditions on France. You see the pattern? Humiliation begets resentment, resentment begets desire for revenge, and revenge begets a new, even greater conflict. But here's the crucial point. We have seemingly already built that trend. That specific cycle of European continental war, followed by punitive peace, followed by an even worse war, appears to be broken, and that's a monumental achievement. Now, let's look at our own time. As we look around our nations, we see the massive, seemingly unbridgeable divides between the left and the right. And from where I'm sitting, both sides often have valid points, but the discourse has become so toxic that finding common ground feels impossible. I'll use my own country as an example. I know most of you listen in the States, but I can't honestly comment on a place I don't live in. Here in the UK, we are grappling with a stagnant economy, unprecedented levels of migration, political corruption, stifling bureaucracy, and a deep-seated class divide that never really went away. But here's the thing, these problems aren't new. They're an ancient human conflict, just packed in contemporary wrapping. What's different now is the volume and the velocity of the arguments. In my view, my nation is both a nationalist problem and a liberal problem. And we know from history, neither ideology, when taken to the absolute extreme, actually works. Yet today, we've completely lost the nuance of this debate. Anyone who expresses nationalist sentiment is immediately labelled Nazi or far-right. Now, historically, this is a profound misreading. The nature of the Nazi Party was so unequivocally evil, so extreme in its implementation of concentration camps and industrial-scale persecution, that the comparison is often lazy and intellectually dishonest. By the same token, anyone who expresses a liberal or progressive sentiment is quickly branded a communist or far left. Again, history shows us that the extreme end of that spectrum, the Soviet Union, the centralization of the state, the horrors of Stalin's Holodomor famine. To equate modern policy debates with that level of atrocity is completely misunderstanding the past. What I'm trying to say is this: even though we perceive that history is repeating itself, it isn't. Not exactly. The nationalists of today are not burning down parliament buildings and building concentration camps. The left today is not centralising all power and starving populations. Of course, everything is infinitely more complex than that simple soundbite. But the crux of the matter is, the core human struggles over identity, resources and power remain the same. We are dealing with the same old demons, but we're fighting them in a new world, with new tools and with hard-won lessons of the past available to us, if we choose to listen. The challenge to us is to not see ghosts everywhere, but to learn to tell the difference between a true echo of history and just the noise of the present. Anyway, if you enjoy the show, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us reach more listeners by boosting our visibility in the algorithm. If you think friends and family may enjoy the podcast, don't hesitate to share it with them. You'll find links to all socials below. I know ads can be sometimes a pain, so if you prefer ad-free episodes, check out our Patreon link also provided. Supporting us on Patreon is a great way to contribute, but it's entirely optional. We also have a merch store, link below, where any purchases greatly support the show and help cover production costs. If you've been listening for a while and haven't subscribed yet, please do so. That way, you'll never miss an episode. Thank you again for your support. So with all that out the way, thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode as we delve into another event and more dark history.